It was February of 1945. Manila was burning. The capital of the Philippines, known as the Pearl of the Orient, was being transformed into ashes. The streets that had once teemed with life now displayed only rubble, smoke, and the heavy silence of devastation. The battle for the city's liberation was at its height, and each block conquered cost lives, dreams, and pieces of history that would never be recovered. In that landscape of absolute horror, where humanity seemed forgotten, two souls were about to meet in a way neither could have imagined. This is the true story of a love that defied empires, prejudices, and the flames of war itself. Before we continue, if you enjoy real stories of love and overcoming adversity, subscribe to the channel and comment below on the time you watch this video. Your participation is very important to us. Let's go back to the beginning of this extraordinary journey. James Miller grew up in a small town in Ohio, where life followed the peaceful rhythm of the seasons, and where everyone knew everyone. The son of a railroad worker and a teacher, James was always a young man of strong values, raised to respect others and work honestly. He had clear blue eyes that reflected genuine kindness and a smile that put people at ease. When war broke out in 1941, James was only 19 and working in his father's machine shop. Like so many other young Americans of that generation, he felt the call of duty and enlisted in the United States Army in 1942. His mother cried the day he left, holding his hands and making him promise to return home. James promised, unaware that fate had prepared for him a path far different from what anyone could have predicted. James's journey across the Pacific was marked by brutal battles and unimaginable losses. He participated in the Leyte landings in October 1944, where he saw friends fall beside him on the blood-stained beaches. He survived the Philippine jungle, artillery attacks, and the searing, soul-melting heat. His courage under fire earned him promotions, and before long he had become a sergeant, responsible for leading a squad of 12 men. James carried not only his military equipment, but also the weight of every decision that could mean life or death for those under his command. He kept a small leather notebook where he wrote letters to his mother, letters he couldn't always send, but which kept him connected to something beyond that hell of metal and fire. In February 1945, American forces launched the final offensive to retake Manila. The city had been occupied by the Japanese since January 1942, and during those 3 long years, the civilian population had suffered unspeakable horrors. And the battle for Manila would be one of the most destructive of the Pacific War, leaving over 100,000 civilians dead and the city virtually destroyed. James and his squad were ordered to advance through the Ermita district, an area that had once been residential and commercial, but was now a maze of collapsed buildings and streets blocked by rubble. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the stench of death was suffocating. Every corner could hide an enemy sniper, every building a death trap. It was during a reconnaissance patrol on the morning of February 14th that James heard a sound that shouldn't have been there. It was a muffled cry, coming from beneath the rubble of what appeared to have been a hospital. The structure was partially collapsed, with wooden beams and concrete, forming an unstable framework that threatened to collapse completely at any moment. His men advised him to move on, arguing that entering those ruins would be suicide. But James couldn't ignore the sound. Someone was alive there, someone who needed help. Against all tactical advice, he decided to investigate. He handed his rifle to one of his soldiers and began crawling through the rubble, carefully moving pieces of wood and concrete, creating a path through that mountain of destruction. The crying grew closer. James could feel his heart pounding in his chest, not just from the physical exertion, but from the strain of knowing the structure could give way at any second. Dust seeped into his lungs, making him cough. Sweat ran down his face, blurring his vision, but he pressed on. And then, in a small space protected by a wooden beam that had fallen at an angle, creating a sort of makeshift shelter, he saw her. It was a young woman, wearing what remained of a white nurse's uniform, now torn and covered in blood and dirt. She was kneeling beside a small child, a girl of perhaps 5 who had been wounded in the leg. The woman looked at James with almond-shaped eyes filled with fear and exhaustion, but also with a flicker of desperate hope. She said something in a language James didn't immediately understand, but the pleading tone was universal. Her name was Keiko Tanaka, though James would only learn this later. Keiko was 23 years old, and a nurse who had been forced to work in the Japanese military hospital during the occupation. She was the daughter of a Japanese merchant who had settled in Manila before the war and a Filipino woman. This mixed heritage placed her in a particularly vulnerable position during the conflict, not being fully accepted by either side. When the Americans began bombing the city, the hospital where she worked was hit. Most of the patients and medical staff died instantly. Keiko survived by being in the basement at the time of the impact, but she was trapped under the rubble. She had found the injured child wandering among the ruins the night before, and despite her own injuries, tried to keep her alive. James stared at the scene for a moment that felt like an eternity. There stood a woman who technically was considered an enemy. She was of Japanese descent and worked for the enemy army. According to the rules of engagement, he was supposed to capture her as a prisoner of war. But what James saw before him wasn't an enemy. It was a nurse trying to save an innocent child. It was a human being in despair. He made his decision in a split second. He reached out to Keiko and said softly in English, the only thing he could think of at that moment, "Peace, peace, I help." "I help," Keiko hesitated. She had heard horrific stories about what happened to Japanese women captured by American soldiers. She had heard the propaganda that painted Americans as merciless demons. But when she looked into James's eyes, she saw something she hadn't expected to find. She saw compassion. She saw humanity. Slowly, she accepted his hand. James helped her to her feet, and then, with extreme care, took the injured child in her arms. The girl moaned in pain, but was too weak to react. James began crawling back along the path he had created, with Keiko following close behind. The process was agonizingly slow. Each movement had to be calculated so as not to further destabilize the structure. At one point, a beam partially gave way, sending a shower of dust and small debris down upon them. James shielded the child with his body, feeling chunks of concrete pelt his back, but he didn't stop. When they finally emerged from the rubble, James's soldiers were shocked. Their sergeant had rescued not only a child, but a Japanese woman. The implications were immediately clear to all. One of the soldiers, a California boy named Tommy, instinctively raised his rifle. "Japanese," he said in a tense voice. "She is the enemy, Serge." James placed himself between the rifle and Keiko, still holding the wounded child. "Lower your weapon, soldier," he ordered in a firm voice. "That is an order. Lower your weapon, soldier." The tension in the air was palpable. The men looked at each other uncertainly. War had taught them all to see the Japanese as absolute enemies, as something less than human. But the sergeant's order was clear. James quickly explained the situation. The child needed urgent medical attention. The woman was a nurse who had been forced to work for the Japanese, but was now saving an innocent life. He wouldn't abandon them. After a moment of tense silence, the men lowered their weapons. Tommy, who had aimed his rifle, looked at the injured child and then at Keiko, who was watching her with obvious maternal desperation, and something changed in his expression. "Okay, Sarge," he said finally, "but this is on you. But this is on you." James accepted the responsibility without hesitation. He created a makeshift shelter in a partially destroyed building his squad had previously checked. Using the basic first aid kit they carried, he helped Keiko treat the child's injuries as best he could. The wound on her leg was deep, and there were clear signs of infection beginning. The girl needed antibiotics and proper medical care, which they didn't have here. For the next few hours, as the sound of battle continued to echo around them, James and Keiko worked together in silence. The language barrier was significant, but they communicated through gestures and the universal language of medical care. James watched Keiko's skill and dedication with fascination. Despite being injured, exhausted, and in enemy territory, she worked with precision and kindness, always comforting the child with soft words in Tagalog, the local language of the Philippines. It was in that moment, surrounded by the chaos of war, that James began to see Keiko not as a representative of an enemy nation, but as an extraordinary individual. She had a delicate face, framed by black hair that was covered in dust. Her hands, though small, were steady and skilled. But it was in her eyes that James found something that touched him deeply. There was an unwavering determination there, a refusal to give up even when all seemed lost. As night fell over Manila, James made a decision that would change his life forever. He couldn't simply hand Keiko over as a prisoner of war. She would be sent to an internment camp, separated from the child she had saved, possibly mistreated or worse. He needed to find a way to protect her, but that would mean putting his own military career at risk, perhaps even facing a court-martial. James told his squad that Keiko was a Filipino civilian nurse who had been forced to work for the Japanese. It was a lie, or at least a half-truth, but his men didn't question it. They had learned to trust their sergeant, and if he said the woman wasn't a threat, they would take his word for it. In the following days, as the battle for Manila continued with brutal intensity, James and Keiko spent more time together. They found a Filipino nun who agreed to care for the injured child and take her to a makeshift shelter run by the church. With the girl safe, James had to decide what to do with Keiko. The right thing to do would have been to hand her over to the military authorities, but he couldn't bring himself to do that. Instead, he hid her in the basement of an abandoned building his squadron was using as a temporary base. He brought her food and water whenever he could, and in the few hours of rest he had, he stayed with her, trying to communicate through her limited English and the gestures they both created. It was through these fragmented conversations that James began to learn Keiko's story. She was born in Manila, the daughter of a Japanese father who came to the Philippines seeking business opportunities, and a Filipino mother who worked as a seamstress. Her childhood was happy, despite the occasional prejudice she faced for being mixed race. She studied nursing because she wanted to help people, and she was working in a civilian hospital when the war broke out. When the Japanese occupied Manila, she was forced to work in the military hospital because of her Japanese heritage. She witnessed unimaginable horrors, treating both wounded Japanese soldiers and Filipino civilians brought in after brutal interrogations. She tried to save everyone she could, making no distinction between friend or foe. Keiko also asked about James, and he shared his own story. He talked about Ohio, his parents, the machine shop, and how the war had transformed everything he knew. With each conversation, their connection deepened. James began teaching Keiko English, writing words on the dusty floor with a twig. Keiko, in turn, taught him a few words in Japanese and Tagalog. They laughed at each other's mispronunciations, finding moments of levity amidst the darkness. But there was something else growing between them, something they both felt but were afraid to acknowledge. It was an attraction that went beyond the physical, a deep connection between two souls who had found humanity in each other in a world that seemed to have lost all its humanity. James found himself thinking about Keiko during patrols, worrying for her safety, counting the hours until he could see her again. And Keiko, who had built emotional walls to survive the horrors of war, felt those walls crumbling every time. James entered that basement with his gentle smile and his blue eyes filled with genuine concern. But they lived in a world that would not tolerate what was brewing between them. The war between the United States and Japan was more than a military conflict. It was a war of propaganda, of racial hatred, of dehumanization of the enemy. The Japanese were portrayed as cruel monsters in American war posters. Americans were painted as demons in Japanese propaganda. An American soldier and a Japanese nurse had no place alongside each other in that reality, and yet there they were, defying all these conventions simply by existing in the same space, sharing scarce food, exchanging stories, and slowly, inevitably, falling in love. The battle for Manila officially ended on March 3, 1945, but the city lay in ruins. Of the historic buildings that had made Manila the Pearl of the Orient, few remained standing. Over 100,000 civilians had died. Reconstruction would take years, perhaps decades. With the battle over, James's squadron was ordered to move to another position. They would be redeployed in preparation for what could be the invasion of mainland Japan. James knew he couldn't take Keiko with him, but he also knew he couldn't simply abandon her. She would be discovered eventually, and her fate would be uncertain at best and dire at worst. He needed to make a decision, and he needed to do it quickly. The night before his squadron's departure, James went to the basement where Keiko was hiding. She was sitting in a corner, lit only by the dim light of a candle he had procured for her. When he saw him, her eyes lit up, but there was also a deep sadness there. They both knew this was a moment of farewell. James sat next to her, closer than appropriate, but he no longer cared about appropriate. "Keiko," he began, struggling to find the right words in simplified English that she could understand. "I need to tell you something. Important." She looked at him intently, waiting. James took a deep breath and continued. I have money. My father sent it before I came here. It's not much, but it's enough. I know a Filipino family. They can hide you, keep you safe. Keiko listened silently, processing every word. Then she asked the question James had been dreading. Why do you do this? Why do you care? Why do you do this? Why do you care? James didn't have a simple answer. There were so many reasons, so many intertwined emotions that he could barely separate them. Finally, he said the only thing that made sense. Because you're a good person. Because war is wrong. Because, he hesitated, looking directly into her eyes. Because I care about you. Because you're a good person. Because war is wrong. Because I care about you. The silence that followed was dense with meaning. Keiko slowly raised her hand and touched James's face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. I care about you too, she said in halting English. I'm scared of what will happen when you go. I care about you too. I'm scared of what will happen when you go. James covered her hand with his. I'm scared too, he admitted, but I promise I'll come back. After the war ends, I'll come back to Manila and find you. Will you wait for me? I'm scared too, but I promise I'll come back. After the war ends, I'll come back to Manila and find you. Will you wait for me? It was an impossible promise. The war could go on for years. James could die in any battle. Keiko could be discovered and sent to a prison camp. 1,000 things could go wrong, and yet in that moment that promise was all they had. Keiko nodded, tears streaming down her face. I wait, she whispered. I wait for you, James. I wait. I wait for you, James. They spent that last night together, not as lovers in the physical sense, but in a deep intimacy that transcended the physical. They embraced, finding comfort in each other's warmth, saying goodbye without words because words would be insufficient. As dawn began to brighten the sky, James knew he had to leave. He arranged for Keiko to be taken in by a Filipino family he had met during the campaign. They were good people, who had hidden other refugees and who agreed to care for Keiko in exchange for the money James offered, and the promise of more when the war ended. He gave Keiko his parents' address in Ohio, carefully written on a piece of paper. If something happens to me, you write to them. They help you. If something happens to me, you write to them. They help you. The departure was swift and painful. James couldn't show much affection in front of his men, so he simply squeezed Keiko's hand and said, See you soon. She responded with the same words, her voice trembling. And then he was gone, marching with his squad through the destroyed streets of Manila, each step taking him further away from the woman who had captured his heart in a way he never imagined possible. He didn't look back, because he knew if he did, he wouldn't have the strength to keep walking. The following months were a whirlwind of military activity. James's squadron was sent to Okinawa, where it participated in one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific War. He saw more men die, more destruction, more evidence that humanity was capable of unimaginable horrors. But through it all, he carried the memory of Keiko, like a light in his darkness. He wrote to her, letters he knew might never arrive, but which he needed to write anyway. He told her about his day, about the friends he had lost, about his hope that the war would soon end. And he always ended the letters with the same promise, I will come back to you. I will come back to you. The war in the Pacific ended in August 1945 after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The world changed forever in those terrible days. James was in Okinawa when he received the news of the armistice. The joy of peace was mixed with a profound horror at its cost. But for James, the end of the war meant something more. It meant he could fulfill his promise. He could return to Manila. He could find Keiko. However, it wouldn't be as simple as he imagined. The army had procedures, orderly demobilization, endless paperwork. It would be months before he could be released from service. Months during which he had no news of Keiko, no knowledge of her well-being, no knowledge of her even being alive. James used every resource available to try to obtain information. He wrote to the Filipino family he had left to care for Keiko, but the letters returned unanswered. The postal service in the Philippines was still in complete chaos, and much mail simply got lost. He tried to obtain a special permit to visit Manila, but was denied. He was desperate, and this desperation was noticed by his fellow soldiers. One of them, a lieutenant named Robert Chen, who was Japanese-American and had served with distinction despite the prejudice he faced, pulled James aside one day. "I heard you helped someone in Manila, a Japanese nurse. They're talking about it. Some officers want to investigate." James's heart sank. He had hoped his decision to help Keiko would have been forgotten in the confusion of war. But apparently, some of his superiors had taken notice. Chen continued, "My advice? Get out of the army as soon as you can. Go to Manila as a civilian. No one can question what a civilian does. Do you understand my advice? Get out of the army as soon as you can. Go to Manila as a civilian. No one can question what a civilian does. Do you understand?" James understood perfectly. If he were investigated while still in the army, he could face serious consequences for lying about Keiko's identity and hiding her. But as a civilian, he would be free to do as he pleased. He expedited the demobilization process, using all the favors he had accumulated during his years of service. Finally, in December of 1945, James was officially discharged from the United States Army. He didn't return to Ohio immediately, as his family expected. Instead, he used his war savings to buy passage on a cargo ship bound for Manila. The journey took weeks, and each day felt like an eternity. James spent hours on deck, watching the ocean, wondering what he would find when he reached the Philippines. Would Keiko be there? Had she waited for him? Would she still care about him after all these months? Doubts plagued him, but he pushed them away whenever they arose. He had made a promise, and he would keep that promise no matter what. Manila in December 1945 was unrecognizable to James. Reconstruction had begun, but the city still bore the deep wounds of the battle. Burned buildings, damaged streets, and everywhere. People trying to rebuild their lives from the broken pieces that remained. James went directly to the address of the Filipino family where he had left Keiko. His heart was pounding so hard, he could hear it in his ears. When he knocked on the door, he was greeted by an older woman he recognized. She looked at him with a mixture of surprise and something that seemed like relief. "You came back," she said in heavily accented English. "She said you would, but we weren't sure." Come, you came back. She said you would, but we weren't sure. Come in. James was led into the modest house, and there, in a small backyard, watering potted plants, was Keiko. Her back was to him and she hadn't heard him arrive. James stood still for a moment, simply watching her. She was thinner than he remembered, and her hair was longer. But it was her. It was really her. "Keiko," he called softly. She froze, the water can still in her hands. Slowly, as if fearing it was just her imagination, she turned. As her eyes met his, the can fell from her hands, splashing water across the floor. "James," she whispered, and then she was running and he was running, and they met in the middle of the yard in an embrace that seemed to try to make up for all the months of separation. They cried. They both cried, holding each other as if afraid the other might disappear if they loosened their embrace. Words were unnecessary in that moment. They had waited. Both had waited, and against all odds they had found each other again. When they finally pulled away enough to look into each other's eyes, James saw that Keiko had changed. There was a sadness in her eyes that hadn't been there before, a weight that the war had placed on her shoulders. But there was also love there, a love that had survived the separation and the uncertainty. "I told you I'd come back," James said, smiling through his tears. "I told you I would." "I know," Keiko replied, her English much improved since they last spoke. "I never stopped believing." But reuniting with Keiko was only the first step. Now James faced an even greater challenge. How could they build a life together? Keiko was still technically a Japanese citizen, living in the occupied Philippines. James was an American who should be returning home. Anti-Japanese sentiment was still strong, both in the Philippines and in the United States. Marrying Keiko would mean facing prejudice, discrimination, and potentially being ostracized by his own community. But James didn't care. He had found something precious amid the horrors of war, and he wouldn't abandon it because of the opinions of others. The first step was to legalize Keiko's status. James sought out lawyers and spent virtually all his savings to obtain proper documentation for her. It was a long and frustrating process, fraught with bureaucracy and obstacles placed by officials who frowned upon a former American soldier helping a Japanese woman. But James was persistent. He had learned in the war that sometimes victory required not only courage, but also patience and unwavering determination. During this time, He and Keiko lived modestly in Manila. James found work as a mechanic, using the skills he had learned in his father's workshop. Keiko returned to work as a nurse in a civilian hospital that had been rebuilt. Their life wasn't easy. They faced disapproving looks on the streets. Some merchants refused to serve them when they were together. Keiko was called a traitor by other Japanese living in Manila, and James was called a fool and worse by some Americans who didn't understand his choice. But they had each other, and that was enough. In the evenings, when they returned to the small apartment they shared, they found peace. James taught Keiko English, and she taught him Japanese. They cooked together, mixing American recipes with Japanese and Filipino dishes. They laughed, dreamed, and planned for a future that seemed impossible to so many others, but for them was real and tangible. In April of 1946, after months of waiting and mountains of paperwork, James and Keiko were finally able to marry. The ceremony was small, held in a Catholic church in Manila with only a few close friends in attendance. The Filipino family who had taken Keiko in was there, as were some of James's co-workers who had become true friends. There was no family on either side. James's parents in Ohio still didn't know about Keiko, and Keiko's mother had died during the battle for Manila, while her father had returned to Japan before the war and they had lost contact. But when the priest announced they were husband and wife, and when James kissed Keiko before those few witnesses, they both knew they had made the right decision. The honeymoon was non-existent. They had no money for trips or elaborate celebrations. Instead, they spent a few days in their small apartment, simply enjoying each other's company without the pressures of the outside world. It was during these days that Keiko finally told James about the full horrors she had witnessed during the Japanese occupation. She spoke of the civilians who were brought to the hospital after being tortured, of the Japanese soldiers who committed terrible atrocities and whom she had to treat as if they were heroes. She spoke of the guilt she carried for having survived when so many others died. James held her as she cried, offering not answers or platitudes, but simply his presence, his unconditional love. He also shared his own scars from the war, the images that haunted his nightmares, the friends he had lost, the impossible decisions he had been forced to make. But there were also moments of pure joy. Keiko discovered she was pregnant in June of 1946. The news filled James with a happiness he hadn't known was possible. They would have a child, a new life born of the love that had blossomed amid death. James began working overtime at the auto repair shop, saving every penny he could for the baby to come. Keiko continued working at the hospital as long as she could, but eventually had to stop in the final months of her pregnancy. They transformed a corner of their small apartment into a makeshift nursery. With furniture James built with his own hands and colorful fabrics, Keiko sewed. In February of 1947, exactly 2 years after James and Keiko first met in the ruins of Manila, their daughter was born. They named her Hope because she represented exactly that to them: hope for a better future, hope that love could overcome hate, hope that the wounds of war could eventually heal. The girl was born healthy, with her father's eyes and her mother's dark hair, a perfect blend of their two heritages. When James held his daughter for the first time, looking at this little miracle he and Keiko had created, he cried tears of gratitude. This little life was proof that something beautiful could emerge from even the darkest scenario, but the joy of having hope was tempered by a harsh reality. James knew they couldn't stay in Manila forever. The Philippines was still recovering from the war, and opportunities were limited. Furthermore, Keiko still faced constant discrimination because of her Japanese heritage. To give his daughter the best life possible, James knew they would eventually have to go to the United States. But this brought its own challenges. How would his family react to Keiko? How would the community in Ohio welcome a Japanese woman so soon after the war? James had maintained sporadic correspondence with his parents, but he had never mentioned Keiko or Hope. He knew he was being cowardly, but he feared rejection, feared his family would turn their backs on him. The decision was made in 1948, when James received a letter from his father informing him that the auto repair shop was growing and that they needed help. It was an opportunity, but also a moment of truth. James wrote a long letter to his parents, finally telling them about Keiko, how they met, their marriage, and hope. He explained that Keiko was a wonderful person, that she had saved lives during the war, that she was kind and strong, and that he loved her more than anything in the world. He said he understood if they couldn't accept his choice, but that Keiko and Hope were his family now, and he wouldn't abandon them for anything. He sent the letter and waited, each day an agony of uncertainty. The reply took almost 2 months to arrive. When James saw the envelope in his mother's handwriting, his hands shook so badly he could barely open it. He read the letter silently, at first, and Keiko watched his face, trying to decipher his reaction. When he finished reading, there were tears in his eyes, but he was smiling. "What do they say?" she asked anxiously. "What did they say?" James hugged her tightly. "They say come home. They say they want to meet you and Hope. They say any woman you love must be special. They want to meet their granddaughter. They say we should come home. They say they want to meet you and Hope. They say any woman I love must be special. They want to meet their granddaughter." The journey to the United States was long and complicated. There was more paperwork, more bureaucratic hurdles, more waiting. But finally, in September of 1948, James, Keiko, and little Hope boarded a ship bound for California. The Pacific crossing took weeks. Keiko spent hours on deck, holding Hope, staring at the ocean that separated her from everything she had ever known. She was terrified. She was going to a country that had been at war with her homeland, a country where she would always be seen as a foreigner, a former enemy. But when she looked at James, at the man who had risked everything for her, she found courage. And when she looked at Hope, at her daughter who deserved every opportunity in the world, she knew she was doing the right thing. Arriving in California was overwhelming. The port was bustling with activity, people coming and going, the sound of English spoken everywhere. Keiko held James's hand so tightly, her knuckles turned white. They boarded a train to Ohio, and throughout the cross-country journey, Keiko watched out the window with fascination and apprehension. America was so different from anything she had ever known. The cities were large and bustling, the countryside seemed to stretch on forever. And everywhere there were signs of prosperity that contrasted sharply with the destroyed Manila she had left behind. But she also noticed the stares. The people on the train watched her with curiosity, and sometimes with barely concealed hostility. She held Hope close, as if her daughter were a shield against the world's judgment. When they finally arrived in the small Ohio town where James had grown up, it was a crisp autumn afternoon. The leaves on the trees were beginning to change color, creating a carpet of reds and golds that Keiko found absolutely beautiful. James rented a car and drove slowly through the familiar streets of his childhood, pointing out places that meant a lot to Keiko. "There's the school I went to. There's the school I studied at. There's the church. There's the church. There's the store where I bought candy. There's the store where I bought candy." His voice was thick with emotion. He was returning home after almost 7 years, but he was a completely different person than the one who had left, and he was bringing with him a family no one expected. His father's auto shop was at the end of the main street. James parked his car outside and sat for a moment, gathering his courage. Keiko gently touched his face. "It's okay," she said softly. "We're together. Everything's okay. It's okay. We're together. Everything's going to be okay." James nodded, took a deep breath and got out of the car. He helped Keiko out and took Hope from her arms. Together, the three of them walked to the shop door. Before James could knock, the door opened. There stood his father, older than James remembered, with more grey hair and more wrinkles around his eyes. For a moment, father and son simply stared at each other. Then James's father said, his voice breaking, "Welcome home, son." The next few days were an emotional whirlwind. James's mother immediately embraced Keiko, unconcerned about her inheritance or the disapproving glances of neighbors. She was simply happy to have her son back and to gain a daughter-in-law and granddaughter. She taught Keiko how to make traditional American dishes, while Keiko, in turn, prepared Japanese meals James's family had never tried. James's father took his son back to the workshop, and they worked side by side as they had before the war, fixing cars and talking about everything and nothing. It was as if James had never left, except that everything had changed. The town, however, was less welcoming. Many of the neighbors had lost sons, husbands, or brothers in the war against Japan. For them, seeing a Japanese woman living among them was an affront. There were whispers in the streets, veiled refusals of service in some shops, and even a few anonymous threats left on the Miller family's doorstep. James directly confronted anyone who dared insult Keiko in his presence. He had survived the war and was unafraid of small-minded prejudices. But Keiko suffered from the silent hostility. She tried not to show it, especially in front of James or his in-laws, but James saw the pain in her eyes every night when they were finally alone. It was little Hope who began to change the hearts of the community. Children don't carry the prejudices of adults until they are taught to do so. Hope grew up as a happy, smiling child who charmed everyone who knew her. She played with other neighborhood children, unaware of the racial tensions her parents navigated. And through her, the neighbors began to see Keiko not as an abstract Japanese woman, not as the enemy of the war, but as a devoted mother, as a kind neighbor, as a human being. The transformation was slow, imperceptible at first. A neighbor who initially refused to speak to Keiko eventually asked for her help when her son became ill, knowing that Keiko was a nurse. A man who had lost his brother on Iwo Jima and who initially threatened the Miller family eventually apologized after seeing Keiko helping his elderly wife cross the street. James and Keiko had 2 more children in the following years. A boy in 1950, whom they named Daniel, and another girl in 1952 named Grace. The Miller family grew, and with it their acceptance in the community grew. James took over the auto repair shop when his father retired, and it prospered under his management. Keiko found work at a local hospital, where her dedication and skill quickly earned her respect among patients and colleagues. The children attended the local school, where they occasionally faced bullying for their mixed heritage, but where they also made true friends who didn't mind their different appearance. In the 1960s, when the United States was undergoing its own social revolution, grappling with issues of civil rights and equality, James and Keiko had already built a life that exemplified these ideals. They had proven in their own small way that love could transcend boundaries of race and nationality, that shared humanity was stronger than the divisions created by war and prejudice. Their home was a place where people of all backgrounds were welcome. They hosted dinners where they served food from various cultures, where stories were shared, and where friendships were formed. Hope grew up to become a teacher, dedicating her life to educating children about tolerance and cultural understanding. Daniel became a doctor, inspired by his mother's dedication to helping others. Grace became a human rights lawyer, fighting for the voiceless. All 3 carried with them the fundamental lesson they had learned from their parents, that love and compassion are more powerful than hate and fear. They were the living legacy of the unlikely union of an American sergeant and a Japanese nurse in the ruins of Manila. James and Keiko grew old together, experiencing all the joys and sorrows that life brings. They watched their children grow up, marry, and have children of their own. They faced financial hardships, health problems, and the inevitable grief of losing loved ones. But through it all they remained united, their love not diminishing with time, but deepening, maturing like a fine wine. On their 50th wedding anniversary in 1996, their children organized a grand celebration. Friends and family came from all over the country. Some of the men who had served in James's squadron in Manila were there, now elderly, but still remembering that day their sergeant had rescued a nurse from the rubble. The Filipino family who had sheltered Keiko sent a heartfelt letter, unable to attend, but expressing their joy at the happiness James and Keiko had found. During the celebration, James and Keiko were invited to share their stories. James, now 74, with completely white hair and hands calloused from decades of work, held Keiko's hand and looked out at the gathered crowd. 50 years ago, he began, his voice still strong despite his age, I was just a scared young man in the middle of a terrible war. I thought I understood what was important. I thought I knew who the enemy was. 50 years ago, I was just a scared young man in the middle of a terrible war. I thought I understood what was important. I thought I knew who the enemy was. He looked at Keiko tenderly. But then I met this extraordinary woman. She showed me that there is no enemy when you see the humanity in others. She taught me that love is not about nationality or race or what uniform someone wears. Love is about seeing a person's soul and choosing to cherish it. But then I met this extraordinary woman. She showed me that there is no enemy when you see the humanity in others. She taught me that love isn't about nationality or race or what uniform someone wears. Love is about seeing a person's soul and choosing to value it. Keiko, now 71, but still with that spark in her eyes that had captivated James decades ago, took the microphone. Her English was now perfect, with only a hint of an accent. When James found me in those ruins, she said, I had lost everything. My city was destroyed. I had no family, no hope for the future. I was an enemy in everyone's eyes, including my own. But James looked at me and saw not an enemy, but a person who needed help. He risked everything for me, and he gave me not just life, but a reason to live. When James found me in those ruins, I had lost everything. My city was destroyed. I had no family, no hope for the future. I was an enemy in everyone's eyes, including my own. But James looked at me and saw not an enemy, but a person who needed help. He risked everything for me, and he gave me not just life, but a reason to live. She looked around the room at her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. Everything I have, everything we built together. It started in that moment when one man chose compassion over hate. Our family exists because James believed that every life has value, no matter which side of the war they were on. Everything I have, everything we built together, began in that moment when one man chose compassion over hate. Our family exists because James believed that every life has value, no matter which side of the war they were on. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. James and Keiko's story had touched everyone present, reminding them that even in the darkest circumstances, human kindness can prevail. James lived to be 83, passing away peacefully in his bed in 2015, with Keiko holding his hand. His last words were to her. "Best decision I ever made," he whispered, "was walking into those ruins." Keiko lived for another 7 years, surrounded by the love of her children and grandchildren. She spent these final years writing her memoirs, wanting her and James's story to be preserved for future generations. She passed away in 2012 at the age of 87. At her funeral, people of dozens of different nationalities attended, all touched in some way by the life of this remarkable woman who had survived war, prejudice, and discrimination through the power of love. James and Keiko's story is more than just an unlikely romance. It's a testament to what's possible when we choose to see humanity over difference, when we choose love over fear. In a world torn apart by the most destructive war in human history, two individuals from opposite sides of the conflict found each other and decided that what united them was stronger than what should divide them. They built a family, a community, and a legacy that continues to inspire today. Their descendants, now scattered around the world, carry with them the fundamental lesson James and Keiko experienced, that true love knows no boundaries, that compassion is more powerful than hate, and that each of us has the power to choose kindness, even when the world around us chooses violence. In the ruins of Manila, amid total destruction and utter despair, an American sergeant saw a Japanese nurse not as an enemy, but as a human being in need of help. That simple choice, that moment of compassion, reverberated through the decades, touching hundreds of lives and proving that even in the deepest darkness, the light of human love can shine. James and Keiko's story reminds us that the divisions we create between ourselves, the boundaries we draw, the categories we place people in, they are all artificial. Beneath it all, we are all just human beings searching for love, security, and meaning in our lives. May we all have James's courage to reach out across divides, and Keiko's strength to accept that hand when offered. May we build bridges instead of walls, choose understanding instead of prejudice, and always choose love. For in the end, as James and Keiko have shown us, love is the only thing that truly matters, the only thing that can truly transform the world. And may the Lord God continue to bless all those who choose the path of love, compassion, and humanity, even when that path seems impossible to follow.